In previous videos we have mentioned mirroring, which is when two people are mirroring each other's emotions. In this video we want to explain this term a little more in detail. We also want to bring up something called projection, which often is a natural consequence of the mirroring phenomenon. We will start with explaining mirroring. There are basically two types of mirroring. One is between a narcissist and a so-called codependent, who is the person that's the target for the narcissist. And the other is between two codependents or recovering codependents. Let us start with discussing this phenomenon by explaining the interaction between the narcissist and the codependent. In other videos, we have gone into details about what we consider a narcissist's true nature. He or she is not a complete soul in the way regular humans are, but consists of human soul fragments from different discarnate souls, patched together in the BLA by the AIF, and sent back to Earth on a mission to keep us stuck in the Matrix. The perhaps most effective tool narcissists have in their interactions with others is mirroring. This is how they hook us. For example, let's say that a woman meets a man and they start talking. The man, who is the narcissist in this case, might ask the woman to tell him about herself. At first she might be reluctant because she doesn't know this man, but she starts telling him some general things, such as her being interested in walking in nature. The narcissistic man immediately responds that he is interested in nature too. As the conversation continues, the woman notices that he is interested in exactly the same things she is. As the relationship progresses, she also notices that he has the same ideas about things, and he enjoys the exact same things she does. This makes her ecstatic, and now she starts opening up more, and she tells him about her vulnerabilities and insecurities as well. The man seems to be very attentive to what she is saying, and he nods and says he understands perfectly because he has the same vulnerabilities and insecurities. By this time, the woman has already fallen in love with him, thinking he is the perfect partner. This sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Who wouldn't want a relationship on that level? Although such relationships are possible and do exist, particularly when we meet our twin flame, it is not possible to genuinely develop this kind of relationship between narcissistic codependent partners. What the man did in the above example was to mirror her in order to come to know her on a deep level, so he knows how to best manipulate her in the future. However, it needs to be addressed that the narcs, who consist of soul fragments only, do have very similar wounds as the rest of us, because their wounds are our wounds, but we'll come to that in a minute. First, let us look a little closer at what a narcissistic man was doing in the above example. He was making sure he earned her trust by acting empathetic and understanding, but also by mirroring her feelings, emotions, and needs. Therefore, a narcissistic codependent relationship can be very passionate and intense in the beginning, because in the above example, the woman thinks she's met her dream partner. However, after a certain amount of time, things start to change. All the narc is after is to get supply from his partner, and to get to the point where he can start feeding on the supply, he needs to earn her trust and get to know her. When this honeymoon phase is over, the abuse begins. The narc is now starting to mirror back the woman's emotions and vulnerabilities in an abusive way in order to get her triggered and reactive, putting her in a vulnerable state so he can draw life energy from her. An example of an overt narcissist could be if the woman, let's say, wants to go visit a friend for a few days out of town. The narc does not want her to go because he is afraid to lose control over her, so he doesn't want her to have friends and relationships aside from that between him and her. He knows about her abandonment anxiety, so he might say, "I don't want you to go. You belong here with me, and if we're going to do something, we are doing it together." They might argue for a while about this until the narc suddenly says, "If you go, you don't need to come back home. I'll be leaving." In the case of a covert narcissist, his response could be something like this, using the same situation as above, where the woman wants to visit her friend. "Do you really need to leave? I would feel so lonely and I would miss you so much. I can't stand the thought of you being away from me for so long." He might also be able to bring some tears to his eyes and act very depressed. His partner will now feel guilty and might cancel the trip. If she still insists to go, the narc will try even harder to make her stay by digging even deeper into her wounds and triggers. In the first example, with the covert narc, the woman will get anxious, her own abandonment anxiety will get triggered, and she is afraid he will leave her, which will lead to that she ends up alone. Already being codependent to the narc, this is not what she wants, so she never goes on her trip. Because the fear of abandonment was such a deep wound inside her, and her narc partner knew this and triggered it, he at the same time mirrored his own abandonment anxiety in his partner, who then reacted with fear and anxiety triggered by her own wounds. And now we can get into how a narc gets triggered and what happens then. Because narcs are just a myriad of soul fragments, they are reactive rather than consciously active. Even the initial bonding phase described above is a reactive mannerism developed out of wounded fragments, utilizing a survival instinct where they need the other persons in order to stay alive. Everything in the narc's environment is triggering, and their response to their environment is always reactive and not conscious. Therefore, other people they interact with, and the codependent in particular, are triggers for them that they reactively respond to. This inevitably leads to that the codependent partners to the narcs trigger them constantly. This is why we see some narcs act out violently against other people, verbally or physically, and this is where projection comes into the picture. Projection is a typical response from narcs, particularly during an argument. When the narcs get triggered, they start feeling vulnerable and out of control. As we know, all they consist of are deep and very painful wounds that they are unable to process. Therefore, in order to cope with their inner pain, they need to dissociate from them. They do that by not taking responsibility for them, and instead, they project their own wounds onto the target. They accuse their target of their own faults and shortcomings by disowning their own inner trauma. This will trigger their opponents, who then will react out of their own wounds. The codependents will now either argue back or withdraw, feeling hurt and confused. When this pattern has been repeated over and over, the targets start thinking that it's something wrong with them, and they take on the wounds and manners of the narcissists. This is why we often see codependents act and react very similarly to the narcs. They become the person the narcs accuse them to be. Other codependents withdraw into themselves, thinking they are bad people, and they stopped interacting with others, not wanting to let their bad traits being exposed. This creates a very complex situation where it's sometimes difficult to distinguish who is the narcissist and who is codependent. However, there is a way to distinguish between the two if we know how the dynamic between them works. A narcissist is unable to process his or her inner wounds and has no self-reflective abilities because of how they are constructed. There is no one in there to process the pain. Therefore they, by default, can't change. However, a codependent is capable of looking at himself or herself and process the pain when called for. Although it's difficult for a codependent to do this, such a person is still able to process the inner pain and make progress. Thus, the bottom line to establish who is who and what is to first observe and then ask the question, who is capable of making progress and who is not? Who can change and who can't?